Here is a motion picture film. Let's tidy up this tangle of film by putting it on a reel.
Hello, it's another episode of the Film Swap Podcast.
Hi, my name's David Seeley, and this is the incomparable, ecstatic gaucho himself, Mr. Jonathan Pritchard Barrett.
That's me. And today we have a special edition because we've got our first guest. And our guest is Clare Clark. And I say hello, Clare.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
And if I quickly introduce you, you're a lawyer, former food journalist, food bank trustee, pantomime impresario, and novelist, published novelist, with a novel called The Sealed Knot, set in the 17th century historical novel. And
That's
it's great to have you here.
Thank you
terrific.
very much. Thank you.
Thanks
and thank
for
you
coming on, Claire. And that's a rip-roaring read, by the way, listeners. So if you want to go and check that out, it's terrific. Terrific fun. So, Claire, tell us a little bit about the novel. That it is terrific. Can you just describe a little bit about how that came about? And
That's very sweet of you. It's just, it's a period of time, it's set in the interregnum. It's a period of time that I'm absolutely fascinated with. And it's had particular resonance, actually, since the Brexit vote, the dreaded, it didn't take long before I said Brexit, did it?
Mm-hmm.
And just, I'm fascinated to learn how people deal with conflict in their communities and how they come to terms with major geopolitical swings and actually make it work because lives continue. So yeah, it was really good fun to pull it together. Thank you.
Terrific. Yeah, well, definitely, listeners, check it out. It's available on Amazon. And I know Claire from, she's been my director on several pantomime productions. Every year as a fundraiser, we've put on live shows at our local town hall every Christmas. And Claire is very talented, writes the scripts and directs us. And as she's described, it's very often much like herding cats. And and she's talked me into doing some of the most outrageous things.
Complete joy. Love it.
Yeah, and it's been lots and lots of fun. And it's really great to have her on the show today to talk about, because we decided on the theme of the show that tonight it would be girl power. And then we thought, well, actually, we're a couple of middle-aged blokes, and maybe we should maybe think about talking to an actual female.
Oh gosh, were you thinking about mansplaining girl power?
yeah, and here we are. And the thing is, us as bona fide sort of self-professed nerds, talking to women isn't always easy. So we thought we'd give it a try tonight. So it's great to have you as our first guest, Claire.
No, I'm thrilled. Thank you.
Right. Mansplaining out of the way. Let's talk about our films tonight.
Wait a second. Mansplaining only just begun.
Yeah. We've got an hour to go yet.
So shall we start tonight with, because you're our guest, we'll let ladies go first, because we're gentlemen here, of course. And we're going to let you describe the film that you chose to swap with us tonight.
Well, I chose for you what turned out to be remarkably not highbrow. It was Lena Dunham's take on a 90s sort of young adult classic novel. And it's called Catherine called Birdy. And it's, on the face of it, quite lighthearted. It's quite funny. It's a bit of a romp through, I think it's set in 1290 in Lincoln, in the Shire of Lincoln. And it's about a girl who is trying to avoid marriage, and about the relationships that she finds herself in, and about the lengths she goes to stop being a woman who is married in 1290, because that for her is death. And it's a great coming of age novel. She really does. She has she had an experience of turning into a young girl whose periods start, who is on the cusp of womanhood, and she's finding her way. And it's a great adventure about finding yourself and finding out what you want.
Oh,
So I
brilliant.
really enjoyed it. But
Well,
it's
that's
not
great.
highbrow compared to the choice
Listen,
you
we
sent me
we
back.
don't talk highbrow here. We just talk about great films, and we recommend
Yeah.
films that we think other people might enjoy.
And I
So
have
you
to
don't have to
say,
worry about any of the highbrow
oh no, I
business.
thought it was marvellous. You stretched my boundaries, which I thought was quite exciting actually. You
Well,
gave
you
me
as
a
well. I mean,
reason.
the film you picked is quite recent film,
Mm,
and I think it's fair to say, I don't know, I don't want to speak for Jonathan, but for myself, it really wasn't on my radar at all. It
mm,
wasn't a film that I was really aware of. I'd heard of the book, but
mm.
I didn't really know about the film, and it isn't necessarily something I would have necessarily watched any time in the foreseeable future. So it's great that you put this one forward, and we'll talk a little bit about it in a few minutes. But first, I think, Jonathan,
Yep.
why don't you mansplain our second film tonight?
Love mansplaining. So our film is called The Passion of Joan of Arc. And funnily enough, it is another medieval sort of, medieval film about a medieval woman. And this one is set in 1431, so sometime later, but in a very sort of similar cultural milieu, you could say. And it's our first silent film. So it was made in 1928, or released in 1928, and the director was a chap called Carl Theodore Dreyer. I think that's how you pronounce it. He's Danish.
I'm glad you said it
And
first.
the star of the film is René Jean Falconetti, who's actually a French actor. It's one of the classics of sort of early cinema, I suppose, or at least silent cinema, perhaps not early cinema.
No, absolutely. I think it's quite regarded as one of the all-time kind of classics. And Dreyer is quite a seminal film director from the early sort of decades of film, and he's
Yeah,
made lots of really amazing films like Day of Wrath and Ordette and Michael and Master of the House. So he's quite a seminal figure, and this is, I think, is to be fair, probably his most famous and highly regarded film. So
yeah.
it was it was great to visit it tonight, and I'm really keen to hear what Claire and Jonathan, what you two thought of it. First of all, we're going to have to go away and watch the films. So we're going to take a little break, listeners. For your sake, it's only going to be a few seconds, but for us, we're going to go and watch the films. Mr. and Mrs. Beasley down the road, they're screening it in their living room, and we're going to go and we're going to peer through the curtains, much like Peeping Tom in our film last week, and we're going to watch the film over their shoulders. And when it's finished, we're going to come back and we're going to talk all about it. So, listeners, stay tuned. We'll literally be back in about 5 seconds.
Thanks for listening to the Film Swap podcast. You can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Audible, and Google Podcasts, or any of your favourite podcast catchers. If you like this podcast, please consider giving the show a rating or leaving a review. This helps other listeners find the show.
We're back.
With our guest,
Yes.
Claire.
Thanks for coming back, Claire. We thought we lost you there when the Beasley's dog chased us out of the back garden. We thought we might have lost you, but you found your way back, so that's awesome. So Claire, we've had a chance to look at the films. We're going to start with Catherine, called Birdy. It's a terrific film, lots of fun, really, really funny and really sweet. And we just wanted to, I guess, start out by just asking why you recommended this film, and talk us through at a high level, just a brief summary about what the film's about.
It is fun, isn't it? It's really fun.
Indeed.
So effectively, you've got a young girl. It's a coming of age movie. It's based on Karen Cushman's much loved novel from the 90s. We can talk later about the backdrop of the 90s that created this kind of image of a girl, but it's very much a kind of coming-of-age movie where the overall message is about discovering your own worth and what you're prepared to fight to keep the narrative of what you think you're worth and where you fit into life. She does a remarkable job of repelling suitors as they are presented to her, because she is effectively her family's saviour, potentially, because her feckless father, Andrew Scott, who does an amazing comedic turn.
Yes, he's very funny.
He's so good.
Very funny.
He's very, very funny. But he's kind of walked the family into pecuniary disaster. So it's on her shoulders to marry well and bring some money in. But she doesn't want to get married. So it's about how she tries to avoid that.
I should point out she's 14.
She's 14.
Yes, I think, isn't she? So
yeah, it was kind of a
quite
thing in those days that women were married quite young, weren't they? They were married off.
There's a play in the film about the fact that she obviously starts her period, and she hides the bloody rags under the floor in the outhouse, because she knows that point is the point at which she's expected to woman up and go and get married and do her duty, and she's desperate to avoid it and keep being a child.
And her father's terrific, because he plays it very well in terms of, because on the one hand he's an unsympathetic character in the sense that he's putting all these expectations on his daughter, but you also can kind of see his kind of desperation and his because he's kind of caught up in these social expectations as well. Absolutely. And he has financial pressures and things, so he's caught in this bind of having to kind of rely on his daughter to be the one to help out the family, as you say. So
absolutely, and his daughter detests him. There's the outset of the film, there is no love lost there. She hates him for putting her in this situation, and she blames him for the social mores and the situation she finds herself in. So yeah, it's amazing how sympathetic he is, really, considering the corporal punishment, considering what he's asking of his daughter. I mean, that's probably testament to Andrew Scott. But he does save himself at the end, not to give anything away.
There's a wonderful, poignant moment where he's, having a go at her again, and then she says all these really harsh truths to him. And he does this little sort of, he backs away and he kind of wipes a tear, because you can see that the things that she said were very, very painful to him. Yeah. But he still then kind of has to, go back to the line of, no, I need you to do this. So it was quite, that's a brilliant scene, really well played, quite touching.
It probably helps as well that he's reflected in the eyes of his wife. Billie Piper plays his wife in a star turn that I didn't see coming. I've spent ages in the film going, who is that? That's Billie Piper. It's not Billie Piper. It's Billie.
Yeah, you're quite used to seeing her always done up with really nice hair and makeup and stuff, and she's a very beautiful woman. But in this, they keep her very plain without very any makeup and things. And
but she obviously doesn't detest him. She understands. She understands the difficulty that he finds and the family find themselves in, and he's kind of reflected in her eyes. That kind of helps him, I think.
I don't know if you saw a year or two ago on the BBC their adaptation of The Pursuit of Love, Nancy Mitford's
I love that book.
Novel. Yeah, and so Andrew Scott was in that playing Lord Merlin.
Wasn't he good?
He's this sort of louche aristocrat who sort of flounces around in silk dressing gowns. Yeah, and it's sort of, this role is quite sort of similar to that, but down to the dressing gowns.
It really is, actually, isn't it? And it's interesting. She doesn't really like her brother Robert, who's very slouchy, and he obviously takes his lead from the father figure. It's so I don't know how much to say at this point.
No, that's good. That's good. You can, I mean, there's always going to be a certain amount of letting the cat out of the bag when discussing films, so you don't have to worry about that at all. Cool. And it's got some great. I mean, some very sort of broad comedy. I mean, it's quite sort of Chaucerian comedy, you might say.
It is.
Lots of sort of farting and stuff like this.
Yeah.
We've got Russell Brand in there. Briefly, which is quite amusing.
He does pop up for a very brief
set a tone, doesn't
he? Yeah. And also old Dennis Pennis, what's his name? His cast absolutely perfectly as this really unpleasant
Shaggy beard. He's repulsive. Yeah.
guy who
Yes.
she's meant to marry.
Yeah.
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 And he's obviously he's supposed to be, what does he say at one point? He makes this big speech going, I'm the 7th wealthiest man in Somerset,
Yeah, exactly.
and I want to fornicate.
I know.
Yeah.
A man without any self-awareness of how he could be received. But I suppose that's the point. This is the social world in which they were in. He didn't have to be pleasant. He could be old and lecherous and disgusting and still know he'd get the girl.
Yeah.
And that was okay because he was the 7th wealthiest man in Somerset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could only dream of such a thing.
So, what is your thoughts, Claire, on Birdy herself, or Catherine, in terms of her position there and the way that she handles those situations?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because she's been really well cast. Bella Ramsey, Game of Thrones, became famous in Game of Thrones, and probably before that actually. But she relishes the filth of the medieval world, and she really she gets quite feral. You know, she's seen like scrabbling in the dirt, and she's filthy. And there's that great line where she comes home filthy, and her nursemaid says something like, "Oh, I washed you only a fortnight ago, and look at you now."
Yeah.
And she wants to. She's not a girl. She wants to attend a hanging. She talks quite like openly about how she really wants to do that, and she is stepping out of her deigned role in that she repulses these suitors. There's a point where she forages some shit, I think, and tries to offer it as a salve, as a kind of like. I mean, she hasn't. There's no holds barred, which is very Lena Dunham, actually. If you ever watch Girls, it's crude and it's filthy and it's feral, and Bella did an amazing job, I thought, of keeping that, and you still feel sorry for her. And I wonder how much of that. I haven't read the book, full disclosure. And I wonder, because that came out of the 90s, that came out of the Spice Girls era and girl power in a kind of neoliberal way, which wasn't really powerful at all. That's just male fantasy. But it's a very different approach to feminism, which kind of blended quite nicely, I think, with Lena Dunham and the grit that she gave Birdy. But she made great friendships. She was still very, very loyal to her friends, she was a dreamer. She's just trying to find out who she is, like we all did as teenagers, like we still are now as middle-aged.
Very much so. It's interesting. I mean, sorry, John, you go ahead.
So one because I watched it with my wife Autumn, and she really liked it. She thought it was absolutely brilliant. And one point she made, which I'm going to relay, won't claim it as mine, but I thought it was very perceptive. She said that Birdy is exactly like a 14-year-old girl. Yeah. She's full of rage and hormones, but also sort of naive and almost babyish. She wanted to be tucked up in bed, and she has a teddy bear at one point, or it's sort of like a wooden teddy type thing. So she's really on that cusp of being still these two parts of her, being young girl and also becoming a woman as well.
I think that's so true. And she clings to the child because the child doesn't have to get married. So but she displays genuine naivety. I mean, there's a lot of jokes around the fact that she doesn't know where babies come from and things like that, and because why would she? But that naivety, she's not cunning. This isn't part of some cunning deception. It's just she really wants to still be a child. And Bella Ramsey's a fierce actress. She can be aggressively fierce. Game of Thrones, she's pulled that through. A completely different character, but she's still got that sort of undaunted look to her, and she carries it off remarkably well. I think she's great. And that I'm conscious that when we talked about the films, that we were going to focus on things like girl power and that kind of thing. And weirdly, I think Bella does such a good job of keeping that idea of an angry, angsty teen when she does these little side speeches about women are people too. It all feels a bit gratuitous in in terms of we don't need it being rammed down our throats that this is a girl power movie, because it's an honest movie, and it could be set today. It could have been set at any time, because Bella is so real.
And the film has a very contemporary feel to it, like they sometimes use, which is a device that I'm not particularly fond of personally, but I can understand that they use sort of contemporary kind of pop music and things on the soundtrack, even though it's set in an historical period. But they do those things to give it that rhythm and that sort of contemporary feel to it.
Did you spot the Billy song? That's how I realised it was Billy.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
I
there's a little nod to the Billy song.
I must admit, with Billy Piper, I only remember that one song that she did when she first came out.
Why do I know?
That's the only thing I remember.
Why do I know the words to this one? This is weird.
I mean, one of the reasons why we called this Girl Power is obviously it's slightly like all of our titles are, is that they're meant to be sort of slightly ironic in the sense that we're, you know, like you say, like the Spice Girls and that sort of superficial assertion of women's
this kind of pretense of empowerment.
Yes, the independence and that, but obviously, but the films that we've picked tonight have a little bit more depth and resonance in terms of talking about female empowerment. That was the phrase I was looking for. And the and that whole idea. So
it's interesting.
I'm glad that you mentioned it.
I think women struggle in films. Like I would say this, but I think we do, because we're stuck in this kind of Madonna or whore complex, and women are routinely either victims, which is sometimes the girl problem discourse, or they are part of this neoliberal empowerment, which, let's be honest, Spice Girls are a male fantasy. That's not about it. It's about dressing skimpily and dancing and singing for the amusement of the masses. Yes. It's not the same thing as a genuinely human understanding of finding yourself. And actually, this film gave me that. I got a sense of a girl who was growing up and didn't know how to respond to the world and was prepared to cut her own path, and that helped because the other men in it weren't all awful. It wasn't as binary as women are great and men are evil because men do evil things to women. It was, she swoons over Uncle George, who's this kind of guy back from the Crusades. He's very honest and very open, and he has remarkably good teeth. So that's. And she does also say, men are duplicitous creatures, but she finds the ones that she responds to and likes and loves. So it's not as simple as girls versus boys. So I thought it was really powerful, actually. Have you heard of the Bechdel test?
Yes.
Well, please, for the benefit of those of us who aren't familiar with that, please explain.
It's a really interesting way of looking at a film. So the rules are, if two women are featured in a film, if they talk to each other, and if they discuss something other than a man, then then it passes the test with flying colours for feminism. And now, you'd think that was a pretty low bar. But
I was just going to say that sounds like
it's
easy.
Exceptionally low bar, but it's actually incredibly hard to find a film where that actually happens. Like, I watched Mission Impossible, maybe Mission Impossible, I was expecting too much, but the conversations between the women in that are all about Tom Cruise. But it is really interesting how few films women get to just be themselves talking to other women about things that aren't a man. So it was interesting. I thought this was good, a coming of age, and it was great.
What can I point to a couple of things that I'd sort of taken note about? One, when you were talking about her sort of being a teenager, there's one there's lots of funny bits in it. There's one bit where there's these boy band monks, and they sort of come out of the cloister, and they're basically a boy band. And then you get to see a totally ripped Jesus, which is also pretty amusing.
With the nice pecs and that was brilliant.
Yeah. And
I love that bit when the monks came out with their hair and she sees them all and kind of goes, because it kind of reminded me, it's kind of like the reversal of, back in the 70s, quite influenced by the film that Jonathan and I talked about in the last episode, The Devils. There was this huge subgenre in the 70s of what they called nunsploitation films, which were basically just set in a convent, generally involved a lot of nuns finding any excuse to take their clothes off and kiss and stuff like that. But that was kind of a funny moment when those monks came out and she looked at them all and they were all with their wavy hair and they were all handsome and stuff. And so I thought that was a nice little sort of role reversal there of the
Monksploitation.
objectifying. Yes, it was monksploitation. So it was brilliant, very funny.
Yeah, it was really, really good.
But they didn't belabor it either. It was just a nice, quick little sort of bit, and it was very amusing. Yeah. And then they, moved on, so it was brilliant.
Yeah. There's a birth in it as well, which is sort of
harrowing.
Pretty harrowing, yeah, exactly. It's definitely not played for laughs, is it? It's sort of genuinely sort of shocking, and sort of has an element of realism there, whereas the rest of it.
But that's the thing about this film. It's anachronistic in a lot of different ways, and the teenage girl is finding her path, and she's exploring herself, and she's much more. She's clearly granted a lot more freedom than you'd expect the average medieval girl, single daughter of a lord, to get. But ultimately, it is rooted and bedded and mired in the muck of the Middle Ages, and birth was a horrible, horrible thing. I don't know how any of us exist, to be brutally honest. And there's no getting away from that. And ultimately, the Birdy's saviour is
that
you
baby.
Don't want it. Well,
in a way, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, it's quite a pivotal moment in the narrative, really. But of course, we don't do spoilers here. So.
No, I'm trying to think of a way of saying that. But you don't want her to be saved literally by a man either. But this is a medieval film.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so I thought it did a good job of not undermining the message of the whole piece. With the narrative. Which, God, I'm talking in circles now.
And again, obviously I'm a man, but it was satisfying in the sense that she maintained her individuality, and it was like her father recognizes that, and it's quite, it's not, so the sense of compromise isn't there that you might expect, that she just sort of, because it kind of seemed like she's just going to accept it and go, okay, this is my lot. I'm going to go off with this hairy, dirty man and just, grin and bear it. But it doesn't, it kind of plays out in an unexpected way. And I think that was quite nice about it as well.
And when her father does what he does at the end of the film, it's motivated not by a kind of masculine dominance to actually get a better deal or to, in a very medieval way. It's motivated by love. And that's ultimately, that's the humanity of it, which I thought was lovely.
Yeah, agreed. Is there anything we want to say about Lena Dunham? Is it Dunham? Is that correct?
Dunham,
Jonathan?
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah.
I must admit, this is, I think, the first film of hers that I've seen. I'm definitely familiar with her in terms of her, celebrity and her other things that she's done. And certainly her first film, which is called Tiny Furniture, is, if someone like myself, who's part of the sort of Blu-ray film collecting community, Tiny Furniture has a bit of a bad reputation. It's something that a lot of male film collectors don't like, that film. I can't comment on because I've never seen it, but I often wonder, having not seen it, if a lot of that reaction, because to be fair, collecting movies and things is very much a male dominated hobby. Not entirely. There are lots of women who do collect and things, but it's predominantly a male hobby. And I think I wonder if the reaction to Tiny Furniture is more just because it's more of a female film than a male film. But I can't comment because I've never seen it, so I don't know if either of you have seen it and could comment on that at all.
I haven't seen it. But I mean, I guess she's best known for her TV show called Girls.
Yeah.
Which
was searingly honest.
Was it?
Yeah, it's,
okay.
Searing is the best word, I think. It's it's brutally honest with regard to. She pulls no punches, and she's not. There's no shame in it either. If you full frontals in the literal and the emotional sense, and she's very good at mixing really good comedy with the kind of the human pathos of just the troubles that it is to go through life. I think she's great.
Okay, well, I mean, I've never had an opportunity to see it, and again, I mean, I'm glad we're having this discussion because, like I said, that's the whole point of Film Swap is trying to expose each other and listeners to films that they might not think about watching, and so I'm really glad we had a chance to watch this film and talk about it because I really enjoyed it. I think it was a really fun and entertaining, clever film, and just a wonderful little story, and the main character was terrific. Jonathan, did you have any last thoughts that you wanted to say about Catherine?
Yes, one or two things. I thought it looked lovely. It had some sort of the natural light and sort of the I suppose what seemed like daylight. I guess it wasn't probably, but and the sort of what looked like candlelight at night, it just looked lovely. And the location, which was at Stokesay Castle, I'd never heard of it before, but it's a beautiful spot in Shropshire. And it had some good jokes. One joke I really liked is where one of the people says, "What a pox? Oh, don't worry, it's not a big pox, but it's a small pox." Yes. What? Small pox?
Yes, that was them going. Yeah. There's lots of lovely little things like that. Yeah. Was there anything else, Jono? Or
no, I think that's pretty much it. But yeah, really enjoyable film. Thank you very much.
Claire, any final thoughts on Catherine called Birdy?
No, just go and watch it.
Just go and watch it, okay. Which is a good point. How did we watch? I watched it. It was on Amazon Prime. I think it is actually an Amazon film, if I'm not mistaken. That's the impression I got.
I think it must be.
So is that where you all watched it? Okay, so it's on Amazon Prime, folks. So if you are a subscriber to Amazon Prime, you can go and watch it after you finish listening to this podcast. But give yourself a few minutes, to take some refreshment and maybe have a loo break or something first.
You're such a dad.
So on that note, I think we listeners are going to take a few seconds break to go and compose ourselves, collect ourselves. And when we come back, we're going to talk about our second film, The Passion of Joan of Arc. So we will be back in just a few seconds. Stay tuned.
You can follow the Film Swap on social media. We're on Twitter and TikTok at Film Swap UK, on Instagram at Film Swap Media, and on YouTube at Film Swap_podcast, and at Facebook at Film Swap the Podcast.
We're back
with our second film, The Passion of Joan of Arc, directed by Theodore Dreyer.
Yes.
One of the greats of world cinema, European cinema.
So a mere sort of 94 years between the two films that we're talking about tonight. But interestingly, I think they do have some thematic connections. Is that fair to say? Is it?
Yeah, it's medieval. I mean, it's probably there's probably longer in time between the periods that they're set in and the creation of these movies. But in broad sense, I think we look at medieval times as quite a large bunch, and it's a similar kind of world, similar enough world.
Yeah.
What strikes me about watching The Passion of Joan of Arc, which I do quite often actually, is
Do
the
you?
fact that I do actually. I really I really love it. And the thing is that it has a very, even though it's a 95-year-old film and it's in black and white, it is a bit timeless in terms of the sense that you don't necessarily, especially when you see a more recent restoration where they've, pimped it all up with digital sort of, touching it up and stuff so it looks new.
Yeah.
It does look very much like a contemporary film, aside from the black and white bit.
Yeah.
It with the faces and the costumes, because it's in an historical setting, and because the newer restoration is very vivid, and they've done an amazing job at improving the image quality and things. It you could be forgiven for thinking it was a more recently made film.
Yeah.
So, Jonathan, do you want to you were going to just quickly just summarize the kind of the basic story, if you will, of the film?
Well, it starts with Joan of Arc sort of in captivity. She's already been captured by the English and their allies, the Burgundians, and it basically goes through her trial, and at the sort of, it's really a sort of at the hands of the church authorities. I mean, they're mostly monks. It seems like they're mostly French, really. I guess there are some English characters in there.
These are the kind of the French collaborators, aren't they, with the English
Yes.
invaders, if you will?
Well, I think the Burgundians, they're sort of semi-French, but they just weren't on the side of the French. They'd rather ally with the English than against the French. So they weren't really collaborators. They were more just their old enemy. And they were. But I mean, then there wasn't. That was one of the themes of Joan, because I did for my A levels, I did St. Joan, the George Bernard Shaw play, and so it's partly about the rise of nationalism, basically the very idea of a nation, because this is at the time there wasn't really an idea of French and English, because the French had basically, or the Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, had invaded England, and they talked French in the English court, and we had. Or the English had like a great sort of chunk of French land that they'd sort of inherited partly from William, but then by various marriages. So there wasn't really a nation. The whole idea of nations was sort of emerging during this period. That's certainly George Bernard Shaw's sort of angle. And so they basically try her, and then they burn her. I mean, that's pretty much.
Oh, spoiler alert! Reach right aboard there.
Well, I mean,
bearing in mind that this is an historical incident, so I think probably anyone could probably guess the outcome. Really.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the poster, you'll see Joan sort of surrounded by flames. I mean, it's a sort of, if you've heard of the story, if you've heard the name Joan of Arc, you've probably known she's been burned at the stake. And
I think the centrally it should be pointed out that this film is very much based on the transcripts of the actual trial. Dreyer made a very much a point, because he was very much that he was very much like Stanley Kubrick in the fact that he very heavily researched all of his films, and he was very, very much a stickler for details and authenticity, and very much making sure everything was absolutely correct. And he's based the film on the actual transcripts of Joan's trial.
Yes.
Although apparently, from what I understand, there were some liberties taken for dramatic effect and things, but for the most part, it is actually based very much on historical fact.
Yeah. And you can look, if you go to the Wikipedia page on it, it links there to the Wikipedia page, the trial of Joan of Arc, and the sort of documentary record, and it's quite extensive, just the sort of summary of it. And I think they had a number of different scribes, and a lot of this has been sort of saved somehow. And but I mean, because it's not a talkie, it's a silent film. So all the dialogue is in title cards. So there's not an enormous amount of words in it, really. There's much more, and that's where the power of the film comes from. A lot of it's just the sort of, well, really, it's just a lot of it's just heads. Actually, it's just close-ups on Joan of Arc's face, and then her accusers and prosecutors. And it's really incredible. I mean, her performance.
When there are longer shots or mid shots in the film, they're always done at sort of strange angles, or the people are framed in a particular way to kind of emphasize, the emotional element of the scene, or some sort of, to emphasize the relationships between the characters or the spaces that they're in. So there's very deliberate sort of times when it's visually, the cuts are a bit jarring in a sense.
Visually it was really interesting as well, because a lot of the clergy he shot looking up at, with the idea that they were these kind of huge monoliths of reason and rationality and clergy, and she was never going to be able to knock them over. That may be just because it's a trial and you do look up in a trial, but I thought that was a good directorial decision.
Yeah, and it also emphasized, because the close-ups, and apparently he was very much against any kind of makeup, because he wanted you to be able to see the blemishes and the more sort of natural features of the face. And when these judgmental men were all kind of leering at her and standing over her, they look a bit grotesque and a bit sort of unpleasant.
They do, don't they?
And it
The
really
shadows.
captures, because if you look at this situation, you're basically, what you're looking at is a teenage girl, because I think if I'm not correct, she was only
She
like
was
sort of
a teenager,
16, 17, 18 years old, something like that. She would have been, despite this image of her as this great warrior who led the French to victory, the reality is she was a prisoner. She was just a young girl, and she was very much, I think that's part of the reason why Jonathan and I kind of suggested this film for this episode, is because for me, it's always struck me that the film is about this young girl who's absolutely trapped in this institutionalized, male-dominated situation, where they're all sort of surrounding her, and they're in this hypocrisy, putting her in a position to try and explain herself and to judge her. And I think it's quite powerful.
It's
Basically,
interesting, isn't it? Sorry.
Carry on.
I was just going to say, she's also entrapped by her gender roles generally, I feel, like watching the film, with Joan of Arc generally as well, because there's a kind of sexualized tint. At some point, someone asks her, was St. Michael naked when visiting you? And that kind of, that idea about there must be something sexual or deviant in this. And of course, she was a cross-dresser. She dressed as a man. She was militaristic, and you wouldn't get any of that from the trial, where she's a woman, and she's a woman who has been unbeautified, I suppose, by Dreyer, but still she's striking. She's emotive, and her, the close-ups on her face. She's a very pretty woman. She's incredible structurally. Very
that seems
eyes.
Interesting too, because that man, when he asked that question, that idea came from him. Yet he's somehow trying to project that onto her, that
absolutely.
She has this kind of, but you're like thinking, well, mate, that's you said that. You're the one who brought it to that level, and you're the one who,
And she wore the Joan of Arc wore male clothes to fend off rape. She was in a very male world, a militaristic one. So cross-dressing was a part of her identity massively, and but that was what she was tried for, as well as the heresy. But it just couldn't compute that she wasn't being feminine enough. Whereas actually, I think the film pitched her as intensely feminine. She was kind, she was patient, she was displaying all the antidotes to the clergy, who were rational and hard and dogmatic, and the more masculine traits. She did a remarkable job of keeping that femininity, and and rebadging it as a positive thing in the face of the clergy against her. Yeah, it was interesting.
But yeah, that cross-dressing sort of element to it is quite important, isn't it? Because she won't. That's one thing she won't stand down on. She won't stand down on the fact that she's getting these messages from either from God or from the angels. I'm not sure, but definitely from on high. And she also won't stand down on the fact that she's going to wear, military uniform, men's clothes, essentially. And this is one of the things that leads to her being burnt, essentially. Not just her beliefs, but the fact that she not just her religious beliefs, but the fact that she won't put on a dress, basically. And I guess one of the sort of the feeling throughout is that she never stood a chance.
Yeah.
There is that overriding sense at the beginning that because these men they're such hypocrites and they're so sort of, as you say, dogmatic that that it doesn't, in a sense, almost matter what she says. And she gives some quite clever responses to their questions and their comments and things. But at the end of the day, that there is that overriding sense that it doesn't matter what she says. She's trapped in a situation where she absolutely has no real hope of somehow, because they don't really even want to be convinced of anything. There is no real, for them, it's all just admit you were wrong, admit there's something wrong with you, admit that this is, you've done these things.
But then by the end, the judge that spits on her, by the end, he's crying. So actually, the men are as weak as anyone else because the events have overtaken and there's nothing they can do about it. They're powerless to stop it happening. So yeah, that strength is almost a show. It's almost a play act of what they expect to be judging.
And we mentioned in the first, when we were talking about Birdy, but the thing about the duplicity of men is that you see that on display here, because when they're not getting the kind of reactions that they want from her, they then go away and conspire and try to trick her and do various things to try and manipulate the situation to get the outcome that they want.
That's right. And when they display those kind of feminist traits of kindness and gentleness, it's basically to be duplicitous to get the outcome they want. It's used as a tool rather than a natural state of being.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So, well, let's talk a little bit about the performance, the central performance of Joan, because you mentioned this extraordinary face in this amazing woman who the majority of the film is all done in these kind of tight close-ups on her face. And you see her constantly struggling with the surprise of the questions about trying to think of what do these guys want to hear? What can I say to them to somehow solve this problem? And she's constantly got tears and she's fearful and never angry, but always there's that sense of fear and dread but also trying to understand the bewilderment. And she's just absolutely extraordinary throughout. This woman, apparently, she was a well-known stage actress who was known mainly for doing kind of light comedies and things like that, which I find quite extraordinary because this is such an intense and powerful sort of performance that you just think you can't imagine her sort of, doing things like that on stage. As far as there's some debate on this, but apparently this is her one and only film. There is some debate that she might have done some little bits and pieces in other films prior to this, but generally speaking, this is the only kind of known performance that she gave in a film. And unfortunately, she has a bit of a sad story as well, as that she went on to because she had some mental health issues, and unfortunately she ended up, I think if I remember correctly, she ended up in Argentina or Brazil.
Yeah,
And she
Argentina.
ended up, I think she committed suicide at some point several years later. And it's a real shame because she's, you could see this and you think, well, you would think someone of that talent and with that kind of amazing charisma and abilities there that she would have gone on to have an amazing film career, but it just didn't turn out.
She kind of epitomizes suffering, doesn't she? She suffers in a very physical way. And I did some research, and apparently the director had her kneel for hours on a very hard floor, which hurts. So when she stood up to act, she was genuinely hurting, which it helped with that kind of suffering, that feeling of quite intense suffering.
Well, that's quite a sort of Christian thing, isn't it? The suffering, and she's quite a sort of Christ-like figure. Very Christ-like figure.
The passion of Joan, it's very, and the soldiers, the English soldiers, baiting her as she heads off to be burnt. I mean, I think that was the reason it was the film was banned when it first came out in England.
It was, it's had quite a checkered history in terms of the distribution of it, and there was attempts to ban it in France as well, and they demanded cuts. And it's quite an extraordinary story, just if we could talk about that for a minute, because this is the kind of thing, Claire, that film nerds love to sink their teeth into. But the film, Dreyer finished it, and it was screened a little bit, and then some of the government in France or whoever it was who was responsible for this, they demanded certain alterations be made. And then, so he did that. So presumably the version of the film might have got screened a little bit. And then there was the original negative was destroyed in a fire. And then he actually reconstructed the film with alternate takes and things. And so there's kind of like a second version of the film that he made. And then that one also got destroyed in a fire. And then in the 50s, there was a man who reconstructed the film from various sources and then re-released it. And he put sort of, music in the background of Bach and Handel and things. And he re-released it to great acclaim. But apparently Dreyer hated it because he was angry about the use of the music in the film and other changes that were made. And then in was it the 70s or the 80s, a print of the original first version of the film was discovered in a closet in a mental institution of all places.
Norway or something.
And there's various theories about how the film ended up there. But it was this great discovery, and it enabled them to, after many, many decades, to release the Dreyer's original version of the film. So, and that's presumably the one that you watched. Claire, did you watch it on Amazon, on the one that's on?
I watched the one using the link that you sent me.
Sorry. No, it's okay.
It was via the internet.
Oh, okay. Well, that's okay, but I think it might be. I don't know what version that is.
That was the same one. It was Criterion.
Okay, great. Brilliant.
Because I started watching that Criterion one. This is on openculture.org.
Okay, great.
And it is the Criterion. It has a sort of Criterion sort of logo at the beginning, but then the trouble is it didn't have subtitles for the title cards. So my French is not very good, but I mean I could understand about half of it.
Yeah,
okay.
It was okay because there weren't an awful lot of words, like you said earlier. So,
I think Claire, we steered you towards that because it is available on Amazon Prime at the minute on their freebie thing.
That's where I watched
Jonathan
it.
and I, we talked about that a few times. But obviously in freebie, they insert little ad breaks periodically, and in some cases that's not so bad if you're watching like Drugstore Cowboy. But when you're watching The Passion of Joan of Arc, you really don't want annoying ad breaks popping up during the film. So so we kind of steered Claire towards watching it on that open culture site instead.
Well, I watched
Sorry,
it
John.
on Amazon, and they have they've got the more cleared up print there. So it's
Yeah.
sort of the one on Open Culture. It's still got that crackly feel,
Yeah.
whereas it's got the sort of cleaner look in Amazon. And so I started, and I thought the Amazon one might have the subtitles, but it didn't either.
Oh, you have to turn them on. I think you have to tell
Well,
it
I
to.
tried, but it didn't seem to want to. In fact, no, it didn't. I couldn't figure it out anyway. But the ads were quite funny, like some dog food. Quite a lot of dog food.
God, you see
But
what I
one
mean?
thing,
It's like
one thing I'd like to say,
heathens they are.
absolutely,
It's like going to the Mona Lisa and sticking a McDonald's, sticker on her nose or something.
yeah.
It's outrageous.
One
I find this
of
kind of thing deeply offensive.
well, it is. I mean, it's ridiculous. But one of the things I wanted to mention about film is that the director Dreyer, Carl Dreyer, he was a very religious man, and I think this is in fact he's sort of thought of as one of the most sort of great religious filmmaker directors, and I think this is and this film should be understood within sort of with this as well. It does have a political element. Be very very quick.
But Joan was canonised, wasn't she, in 1920? So
Yes, that's the extraordinary thing that it's taken that long for her to become a saint. When I was doing my research, I found that out. But I think partly her saintliness is her sort of suffering for her cause and being, like Christ-like, being burnt or killed for her sort of faith, as it were. But also, I've just those incredible long shots of the people and especially her. I really just sort of emphasize her extraordinary humanity, which is sort of that sort of, I guess that sort of see it from a religious point of view. The sort of the inner light is what he's looking at there.
That is a theme that runs through all of Dreyer's films. Is there's quite a religious context to all of them, I think. One of his films is quite ties in nicely with one that we were talking about in the last episode, Jono, because his Day of Wrath is kind of a film about kind of a witch hunt and about like the persecution of a witch or a woman who is accused of being a witch in a sort of a religious community.
Wow.
And it's quite an amazing, very very harrowing film. And I just thought it was interesting how it has some similarities to The Devils that we talked about last week.
Sounds great.
Yeah, it's terrific. So, I mean, really, all of Dreyer's films are fantastic and worth checking out. Definitely.
Yeah. I've become really interested in them now. I want to see more of his stuff.
Yeah.
It seems too obvious to make the point, really, that a film about Joan of Arc in a clerical trial is religiously motivated or imbued with symbolism. But that, especially that bit at the end, the death scene, effectively, where that scene juxtaposes with a woman with a baby suckling at the breast, and that, I mean, then it's obviously a Madonna, and it's obviously that's how women are in the film for him. That's what Joan is. She's a Madonna, which takes us back to the point we were making right at the beginning, wasn't it? About women being Madonnas or whores. Basically, it's quite simplistic as to how women are presented in films. So when you have Joan of Arc as the Madonna, effectively, it's still another objectification of women. And despite, for our modern audience, the whole Me Too movement is alive and kicking, but still women and violence towards women and the objectification of women is still normalized, and it's still in mainstream cinema. Because this is really, at its heart, this film, isn't it just a big bunch of ugly old men torturing a young girl? That's effectively the story.
Pretty much.
Both psychologically and physically.
Yeah, they're enjoying it. They're enjoying it for a large part. They enjoy the power. They enjoy the power play. And when they can't win with reason, they resort to threats of violence and force, and they intimidate her into confessing. They use threats of torture and death, and even the set kind of is violent towards her. The kind of the stark black and white set is all very jutty, and quite angular and oblique, and that feels quite oppressive as well. So yeah.
And I think that is the power of this film. And I think one of the reasons why we wanted to kind of choose this and put it forward tonight around this theme, because it kind of lays that all bare. And whether you look at it symbolically or even just literally or historically, it just lays that out quite barely. That and you can't escape it as a viewer because of that. You're brought right into it, and you feel the emotion quite viscerally. And I think that's one of the really great powers of it. As an experience to view it. You know. So yeah, it's interesting you brought up about the set, because reading about the film in preparation, I love the story about the fact that at the time this was one of the most expensive films produced in France, and a lot of that was to do with the construction of the sets.
Oh, wow.
And they made this elaborate, very detailed and historically accurate, great, huge building that they used as the set in this. But then, of course, Dreyer, in the style that he chose to use, was in all these very tight close-ups and these angles and things to accentuate those points that we're talking about. But then apparently all the producers, who had spent quite a great deal of money on making this huge construction and this elaborate thing, were not amused that it hardly is seen in the film. Or like in the sense that you can't see it, but you can certainly feel it. And like you say, the use of it is more emotional, and it uses the space in ways to emphasize the kind of the psychology of the moments in it. So
that's a good point.
Yeah.
So I wonder what happened to it. If they made it out of concrete, presumably it's sort of difficult to pull down. It's not sort of canvas that you can just sort of put, burn at the end of the thing.
I think it's like a Dunkin' Donuts now or something. No. I'm just making that up. I have no idea, actually. I mean, because a lot of times film sets, like, down in Los Angeles and things in the States, they still have, I mean, I would love to see it someday, but apparently Universal still has the opera house from the Phantom of the Opera, the original Lon Chaney one. And it's all still there. And I would love to, I would like do a pilgrimage to go there and see that someday, because it'd be extraordinary. But they do, they build these things, and they used to build whole towns and things for the Westerns, and then they just use them over and over again. And I remember in Japan, I visited Toei Studios, and they had these whole sort of sets for sort of samurai pictures and things like that, and they just use them as like working sets for years and years.
Brilliant.
Yeah, so it's
I remember
amazing.
going to Popeye Village in Malta.
Right. Lovely. That would be cool as well. I am what I am.
That's great.
Yeah. My last comment on Joan of Arc, sorry.
Claire, actually, if you don't mind me asking, because you mentioned at the beginning of the show about how going into this film, this is maybe something that you hadn't experienced before, about watching a film like this. I just thought, like, from your perspective, what would you say to a listener or a viewer out there who was maybe a bit put off by the idea of watching an old silent film? Because I very often have conversations with people, and sometimes they'll say, "Oh, I don't like black and white films," or "I don't like watching subtitles," or there's all these barriers that they put there to sort of shut themselves off from watching things. And I'm just, from your point of view, what would you say to someone who would kind of hear us talking about this and go, "Oh, I'm not interested in watching an old scratchy old silent film"?
So before this, I've never watched a silent movie from start to finish. I've seen clips of a Charlie Chaplin like kind of comic rate sort of romp every now and again, but I've never sat and watched the whole thing. and I think it felt remarkably fresh. It's very visceral. It's hard not to be affected because she does carry that role so well. And because there's no makeup, because he let the beautification speak for itself, or whatever he said. She looks modern. It could have been filmed last week, and it's not heavy on the words, and they didn't get in the way, which I thought they might.
Yeah.
So it actually felt incredibly, incredibly modern, and it very visceral. It's hard not to react to it. So I'd tell you, close the curtains and just free your diary and just sit down and enjoy it, because it is an amazing piece of storytelling.
Brilliant.
And like you say, it is very, because obviously before sound and the technology change and sound came into film, it was very much a visual medium, and they told the stories, visually. And so that's, once you kind of acclimatize yourself to that.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, some of these films are very, very amazing and quite a great experience to watch.
I think you hit on the right thing there, where you said acclimatise, and I was expecting to do quite a lot of legwork to get myself through the 2 hours odd to make it work. But actually, I acclimatised remarkably quickly, I think, and because Dreyer's film is amazing. It's a piece of art. It's a piece of art.
It's a lot about perceptions, isn't it? Because I know growing up, they used to, and it has to do with frame rates, because back before they brought sound in, there was varying frame rates that they used to film things in and project them at. But once sound came in, there became a standard 24 frames a second. That became it. But when I was growing up, when they used to show old silent films on television, they were sped up. They were too fast. And so a lot of times people still have that perception, I guess, at least people of my generation, of seeing silent films where everyone moved around really fast and ran around fast. And I think people just have that kind of perception of them. But nowadays, the technology has changed. They can now adapt the frame rate properly, so that when you're watching them on television, they are at the proper frame rate, and you see the movement and everything is natural. And also now the technology that they can go back to these old prints, and if they're lucky enough, because a lot of old silent films haven't survived because of the nitrate and things, that it's very rare. I think something like sort of 90% of all silent films have been lost forever.
Yeah.
But the ones that they do have, the technology now, they can compare frames and remove the scratches, and they can bring out a lot more detail, and they can sort of stabilize the image and stuff. So, I mean, the latest restoration of Passion of Joan of Arc is extraordinary quality, and it is literally almost like a new film.
It is.
And
That's
it
what it
is,
felt like.
yeah.
And there was no stylized eye makeup from the 20s. I didn't feel like I was watching the kind of heroine that I would expected to see.
When you watch these old silent films, I should recommend watching one sort of live, as it were, because often, well, basically, whenever they showed these things in the cinema in the olden days, they'd have a sort of live music, and that live element to it is integral, because I mean, we've been to a few films, black and white, sort of old silent films they did together, and even just recently, near where I live, they showed some old Harold Lloyd, and there was a chap playing the piano there, and just the sort of slight response to the sort of the movie, that sort of, well, it's just a live event. And that really adds to the. I mean, it's as you say, this film is a visceral film anyway, and then with the sort of live music, it takes it into a sort of different. It's a different type of art, really.
I was going to ask you, actually. My great granddad was a pianist in the silent movies. So,
wow.
That's amazing.
and he did it down in Brighton. But it's. I was wondering about the music in terms of whether, because I think a lot of it was improvised. There wasn't a score that you followed. You kind of made it up, and it could be different.
It would
night to
depend.
night.
If it was some big sort of films, they would initially have a composed score, and they would have a live orchestra, and they would perform it. But that would be in these big, huge movie palaces that they used to have. But then later on, you're quite right. They would have people like your grandfather who would have just had various pieces of music that would fit different moods, and they would literally just be sitting in front of the screen with the audience watching the film, and they would just play things that seemed appropriate.
Yeah.
So you might get a little bit of Schubert, and you might get a little bit of ragtime, and you might get a little bit of something else, but anything that kind of fit the
So
what was happening on screen.
I haven't done any research into the score for Joan of Arc. Was that
Yeah.
designed? Like, was
Well,
that composed from start to finish?
there was a score written for it specifically, but I don't think any of the current sort of commercial sort of Blu-rays or anything use that original score. I don't know if it survives in its entirety, or maybe there's only fragments of it left. I can't remember, to be honest. Maybe one of our listeners could enlighten us on that if they have a few more details about that. But I believe that, nowadays you get a lot of silent films get screened and they have live accompaniment. And then sometimes it'll be like pop groups or certain particular musicians or whatever will specifically write their own scores for the films. And then they do a concert screening of the films. I think, like I have here, the Masters of Cinema Blu-rays, the one that I have at home. And there's a couple of different options. They have, I think, 2 or 3 different scores on this that you can choose which one that you prefer. Because I think sometimes it's, sometimes some work better than others, I think.
That would probably lead to quite a different experience, actually. That would be
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. And it's nice to have the option because you could try it one way and then maybe the next time you watch it, you could try the other score and then you can sort of say, oh, well, I prefer that one. Yeah, sorry, John.
Choose your own adventure.
Yeah.
One person I'd recommend looking up is a chap called Neil Brand, and you hear him on the BBC sometimes talking about film music. But he also, I went to see a film, one of the Kevin Brownlow's collection, Stella Dallas from 1928.
Stella Dallas, yeah.
It's been remade 3 times, once with Julia Roberts. But anyway, this was the original 1920s version. He was playing the piano, Neil Brand, and it was one of the most amazing, absolutely incredible cinematic experiences. And the one bit, especially where he's playing the piano, and then there was not a beat, and then suddenly he was playing the flute. I don't know. If he had a piece of string, then it's sort of. But anyway,
brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the key thing, I think, is that what we're saying. I mean, Jonathan and I obviously take a keen interest in sort of the history of films. And so there's a bit of an appeal from that perspective about watching these old films because you can see the history in the old buildings and the clothes and you can read about the background and the production and things. But it should be stressed that people, if they somehow think that these films, because they're old, that they won't enjoy them, I think that's just something that it's worth considering just to try some out and see, because you'd be really surprised at just how there's many of them are still very accessible, very entertaining, and really great. Some great films.
So
absolutely terrific.
For widening my horizons.
No, not at all. Well, like I said at the beginning, it's the same because I think I spend a lot of time watching older films or films from other countries and things like that. So things like Catherine called Birdy kind of pass me by because sometimes I don't focus very much on sort of new films, and so I guess we've kind of. That's kind of the real nature of Film Swap, isn't it? Is that we've introduced something to you and you've introduced something to us, and it's great. And they're both terrific films, actually. So,
yeah.
So Claire, is that cinema still there?
Well, no, sadly it closed in 1939. But you can
only yesterday.
A shame.
And it went through about 8 different name variations in its life. It opened in 1911 and closed in 1939. But you can check it out on brightonhistory.org.uk. Have a page on all the cinemas, and you really get a sense of just how important cinema was. Because it lists, there's literally hundreds in Brighton and Hove, all showing presumably silent movies at the time, and it was a key part of life and recreation.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's amazing. Well, yeah, we'll definitely include a link, and if you don't mind providing that link there,
Sure.
I'll include that in the show notes.
I was going to tell you about silentlondon.co.uk, I think it is, and that'll be in the show notes. And it's a website where all things silent film in London are listed. But there's another site, if you live outside London within the UK, called silentfilmcalendar.org. I'll give you that for the show notes too, where it's everything sort of around the rest of the country.
Brilliant. Okay, yeah, that sounds great. So we already talked about if listeners want to watch The Passion of Joan of Arc, we did mention that it is currently available as of our recording. Anyway, it's available on Amazon Prime. But as we stated, it is a that freebie thing, and they interrupt it with commercials for dog food and hamburgers and stuff. So that isn't the ideal way that you want to experience a film.
No.
I also held up the Masters of Cinema Blu-ray. That is still in print and available. Although you won't get all this fancy deluxe packaging because the way they do it nowadays with these boutique labels, Claire, is that they release them in these limited editions in the first instance, and then when that sells out, then they release a kind of a standard version, and that one is still available. So I'll include a link to the Masters of Cinema page on our show notes. And for our listeners in the US, Criterion does a great Blu-ray as well, and it's got that soundtrack. What's it called? The something of light. Sorry, I can't remember. I don't have that one. But there's quite a famous soundtrack that someone wrote for it that uses sort of choral voices and stuff, and it's quite good. I actually have a CD of just the music, but I don't have a video with it on the film. So, but anyway, so U.S. viewers might want to check that one out. It's been a great conversation, and Claire, thanks so much for coming on and talking with us. It's been a really great.
It's been a joy.
And I hope you'll come back and maybe do another swap with us another time.
Absolutely.
Or something.
Definitely. That'd be great.
Yeah, well.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, well, thanks again, Claire, and thanks, Jonathan. And
Great stuff.
We'll maybe wrap it up there. For you people out there who are listening, thanks for joining in tonight. And drop us a line, let us know what you think. We'd love to hear from you if you got any comments on the films we talked about tonight, or you want to recommend some other great silent films, or you have any other sort of coming of age young females coming of age films, or anything that you want to draw our attention to. We'd love to hear from you. So come out and find us on social media and stuff like that. And we'll see you soon.
Goodbye.
Bye.